Good morning. My name is Dennis Kinney, and as Chief Welter pointed out, I am an academic. I'm a professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. What he didn't share with you, though, is that he and I have known each other for quite some time. Is it working? Can you hear? And that in that time, he's been very good at sharing his experience and his ideas and so forth that he's generated, through his many years of experience. And I've come to conclude, after listening to him and his ideas, that he's absolutely right, that it's not the police officers that are screwing up out there, it's the assistant chiefs. I spent a good deal of time last night thinking about what my presentation actually should be called, and I was really stuck between two. One would be the great myths of modern law enforcement, and the other would be much ado about nothing. Since the latter was already taken, I decided that what I would focus on today would be the two big myths that I think are driving a good deal of American law enforcement. And I think that they're particularly relevant to this session, this conference, because they deal with the two topics that we're talking about here. The first myth is that there is such a thing as problem-oriented policing in this country, that it's actually happening. And the second myth is that investigations, at least as we currently do them, matter. Last year's conference, Nancy asked me to talk, as many of you know, you were here, the conference was about accountability. And I noted during last year's conference that it's pretty hard to find police officers in this country who don't at least know the rhetoric of problem solving. They've had training, various kinds of training, collaborative problem solving, the mechanics of problem solving, supervising problem solving, so forth. These courses are fairly common and are available in a lot of different places. And as a result, when you meet with police officers around the country now, they pretty well know all the acronyms and all the language and so forth of problem solving. Equally available, however, is a host of observers who spend a lot of time both training and working with police, and in fact, lots and lots of police officers themselves. In fact, most of the consultants are police officers, who point out that problem solving has largely failed in a good deal of the departments that they've either visited, worked in, or worked with. That in fact, problem solving doesn't really seem to take place. That what in fact we tend to find is, as we look at the various POP efforts around the country, is really little more than traditional efforts that masquerade as problem solving. What we find, for example, is that we want to do a particular response. We want to do a gun buyback program, or we want to do a crackdown, or some sort of a school safety program. And so what we do is we go out and we collect a little bit of information to try to justify that response so that we can demonstrate that that response is called for. If we're a really good department, then we go about conducting some sort of an implementation study. We ask other departments how they did their gun buyback program so that we can do it more effectively and more efficiently, and we call that whole process the analysis stage. So we come up with our own problem, and we go through the process of justifying the response that we want, and we declare that to be problem solving. I was sure that that was the case last year. I'm even more certain of it this year. And let's look at a couple of examples that have occurred over the course of the year to kind of reinforce that notion. This year and last year, the COP Shop, the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, has funded many, many millions of dollars for problem-solving projects around the country for police departments. Yet I think it's something like 454 departments, which probably means some of your departments may in fact have gotten those grants. I've spent some time talking with the officers, the problem-solving trainers and so forth, who go around the country and have provided some consulting and technical assistance and so forth, have participated in the meetings where they've come together about what it is those agencies are doing. Where's Craig Honeycutt? Captain Honeycutt. Of the agencies, Craig has done a lot of time, spent a lot of time working with them. Of the agencies, Craig, how much problem solving would you say is going on?
Almost none.
Okay. The Bureau of Justice Assistance has funded a problem-solving gang initiative a few years back, where they gave a good deal of money to 4 different police departments were involved, but a variety of other organizations were involved as well, to use problem-solving focus, problem-solving effort to deal with gang problems. Deborah Weissel spent a good deal of time working with them and has done some publications out of it. Where's Deborah? How much problem-solving did you see, Deborah?
There was some solving of problems, but it was mostly accidental problem solving. They stumbled on a good response.
Similarly, I was talking with some folks, for example, from the Charlotte Police Department. Now, this is not just a phenomenon that occurs in kind of the new departments that have gotten into this, but we've got a few departments around the country, San Diego, Charlotte, St. Petersburg, some other departments that are well known for having been involved in problem solving for quite some time and have really developed quite a reputation for it. And I was talking with some of the folks in the Charlotte Police Department who were telling me about, they were very pleased because at the San Diego conference, as you know, they have a Herman Goldstein Award where they give awards to the top problem-solving projects in the country for the year. And what they were saying, they were pointing out that over the course of the last 2 years, they'd had 7 projects that they felt were suitable for nomination. But as they, including the former police chief there, Dennis Nowicki, were looking at the various efforts that they had nominated, they examined them and they concluded that, in fact, there wasn't a lot of problem solving involved in those either. Similarly, when they look at the different panels that have been proposed for a lot of the POP conference, there's a regular review process that they go through. Something like, I don't know, 80 or 90 different panels that are proposed where people will come in and make presentations about their problem-solving efforts. In fact, I think the review panels have said that they find, I don't know, something like 5 or 10% of them are really good examples of problem-solving. I know John Lasardi's been on that panel. What percentage, or how many of those, what percentage would you say involve investigations? Okay. The point of all that is, I mean, obviously the examples could go on and on and on, but I think you get the point. What we see is in this country is a lot of rhetoric about problem solving. We know the language. We know how to talk the talk, but for the most part we don't seem to actually apply the model very much. So we don't seem to actually do that much of the walking of the walk. Now, we went through a period, and this is not new news. I'm sure that, that you're all, aware of this and have thought about this and so forth, because there's been quite a few publications, again, most of them practitioner-oriented, that have focused on why we haven't done a better job of problem solving. At first, we blamed it on training. The problem was that the officers were under-trained. They didn't really know how to do problem solving. The cop shop, however, over the course of the last probably 5 or 6 years has spent a ton of money developing training, and I know that a good deal of your agencies have done so as well, and I know there's private groups out there that are doing training and so forth. So I don't think the problem really is training anymore. So we've also looked at poor supervision, we've looked at inadequate free time, and a whole bunch of other things that in isolated cases we can see are problems that have cropped up that have given police departments issues with actually making problem-solving work. And probably a lot of times, maybe even many or most of the times, a lot of those things, in fact, are present. They can't account, however, for the failure of the widespread, consistent failure of the idea to catch on. Why departments across the country consistently are having so much problem adopting the problem-solving model. If not, then what does? Well, I want to suggest to you that there are 2 fundamental problems with problem-solving today. And I'm happy to say that when we look at those and we couple those up then with what I think is the second myth about investigations, that it suggests some ideas to us that unfortunately I'd like to be able to take credit for, but the ideas for solving the issues that we're confronting are actually 30 years old. We tried it back in the early 1970s. The first problem with problem solving is that we have to confront the very real possibility that we don't actually mean it. That we as administrators and leaders and city managers and citizens and so forth talk a lot about wanting problem solving, but in fact, we really don't mean it. Some years ago, Solomon Zhao did a study on police agencies, police organizations as to why they change. It's called Why Police Organizations Change. And what he found was that the change was dramatically different if it was internally driven versus externally focused. That if in fact if it was externally pushed, that the change tended not to be real and it certainly tended not to last. And what we find today as we look at problem solving was that it was an effort that began 20 years ago and began fairly slowly with a small number of departments warmly embracing it. Today, however, the vast majority of problem solving efforts that we see, of problem solving focuses in departments, didn't come from inside the department. They're grant-funded and they're crisis-driven. As a result, I think what it really does make Zhao's point very well, that what we're seeing is not changes that are coming from within the organization that the organization thinks are important, but they're changes that are being thrust upon organizations, and the result is that the buy-in simply isn't there. For example, for those of you who know my work, know that I've spent a good deal of time in the last few years working on crime in the schools and problems with crime in the schools, and that I'm a proponent, a very big proponent of problem solving to address those crimes, particularly if that problem solving is student-centered, if the students are the ones who actually do it. Now, there's a lot of departments around the country and school systems around the country that are now doing student-oriented problem-solving or police problem-solving partnerships, but I find myself wondering if it hadn't been over the course of the last 2 years that we've had about 10 shootings in schools, and if it hadn't been that the federal government is spending about $20 million funding many agencies to do these sorts of efforts, I wonder how many police departments in this country would have actually gone that route, would have actually adopted a focus where they would work with teachers and students and so forth to address the problems. And let's face it, if it was a good idea, if it is a good idea, then it was a good idea before either the grants occurred and before the shootings occurred. Aside, however, from those sorts of problems, what we also see is a lack of commitment from the agencies themselves, from police departments themselves, to making problem-solving work. We frequently recognize that problem-solving in community policing can't be a program, that it has to be a philosophy. And yet, when we look at agencies that are doing problem-solving, what we find is very little effort on the part of the leaders to institutionalize that philosophy or to actually promote it. For example, we tell officers that we want them to problem-solve, and yet we continue 20 years after the concept was introduced. Goldstein wrote his first piece, I guess, in 1979. It's now 1999. We continue to evaluate them on other things. So we say we want you to problem solve, but we aren't going to evaluate you on it. Now, I know some of you probably are going to point out that some departments have in fact changed their evaluations to incorporate problem solving, and I've seen some of those evaluations, and with very few exceptions, what they focus on is, for example, counting the number of POP projects that an officer says he or she introduces, or counting the number of community meetings that the officer goes to. So while we note that, gee, we shouldn't be counting beans, in fact, what we've typically done is simply substitute the beans that we count. We look at different ones instead of tickets. We look at community meetings. Similarly, we send officers out to fix community or neighborhood problems, yet we give them very little guidance on how they should prioritize those problems. We recognize that the problems that the neighborhoods confront may not be the problems that the police department thinks are important, and we tell them to develop this nice laundry list of problems that they can focus on, and then we even in the training teach them 3 or 4 different methods that they can use to prioritize those problems. We don't give them any guidance for the most part, however, on which of those methods of prioritization we would prefer, or which ones we think would be the most effective, or which ones we would like them to do. In fact, we seldom even tell them what issues are legitimate issues for the police to be focusing on at all. In addition, we tell them to go out and form community groups or work with community groups, mobilize them, and if they don't exist, then we want them to work to put those community groups together to be able to address the various problems those neighborhoods have. In addition, we want them to mobilize those groups and to then bring a host of resources together to be able to solve problems, different community resources, different governmental resources, and so forth. Meanwhile, we as police managers, for the most part, can't even get different parts of the police department to work together, much less getting other city organizations involved. So we're asking the officers to do something that we clearly either don't have the ability to do or refuse to do. Beyond that, however, it isn't likely that conceptually we mean what we say either, and let me give you 2 examples. Right now, there's a good deal of funding going on and a good deal of projects going on to deal with school crime, particularly using the problem-solving approaches and especially involving students. A good deal of those projects now are coming off track, however, and one of the major reasons that you consistently hear when you go into the schools is that the teachers will point out to you that they have standardized tests that they have to administer, that they use to measure the progress of students through schools, and devoting time from the classroom to be able to address these sorts of concerns and crime and fear problems and so forth take away from teaching those tests, and therefore we just can't do that. Probably a better example, however, I was fortunate to participate in a discussion group at the Eastern Kentucky University several months back, where they brought together a group of domestic violence advocates and community policing advocates. And the whole idea was to spend 2 days discussing how domestic violence and community policing can kind of come together, and we can use community policing principles to be able to deal with the problem of domestic violence. Because both of the groups of advocates, however, were from completely different camps, they began the process by having about a half-an-hour presentation by leading advocates of both sides. So the domestic violence advocates told us about the domestic violence issues and what their thrust has been so that we would be up to speed on their approach, their concerns, and then the community policing people did exactly the same thing, so the domestic violence people would be up to speed on community policing. What became obvious, however, by the time we got to the end of the first hour is that those two movements are in direct conflict with each other, that they can't work out the problems. The domestic violence movement, you see, what they pointed out was that what they wanted, what they were pushing for, was an approach where when there is evidence of domestic violence, there is no discretion, that the officers will execute a mandatory arrest and take the abuser out. The community policing advocates, meanwhile, explained what they want to do is get away from using arrests, that what they want the officers to do is examine the problems as they exist and develop unique solutions to each one. The domestic violence advocates were horrified when they heard that, because they pointed out that what is more likely to happen is simply a reversion back to the bad old days of police officers who basically cut the abusers a good deal of slack. After a day and a half, unfortunately, we were unable to resolve those issues, and we were no further along than when we began. Beyond the administrative or leadership issues, however, it appears that the POP model itself is causing havoc. What consistently is noted when we examine problem-solving efforts is that the breakdown occurs that there's very poor problem identification, and because there's very poor problem identification, there's virtually no analysis, or it's just skipped altogether and we go immediately to the response stage. And at the heart of all of this, I think what we see is the point that Deborah Weisel just noted a minute ago, and that she also noted in a publication that she did examining the problem-solving gang effort, is that there's a dramatic difference between solving a problem and doing problem solving. They are not the same thing. Both can be important, both can be valuable, both are good police work. Only one, however, tries to systematically understand the how and why of a problem so that it can be addressed at its fundamental base level. I'm going to suggest to you here and now that police patrol is not particularly well suited for doing that function. Before we go into that, however, let's look at the second myth, and that's the one that centers on the investigative process. There's a good deal of research that if you go back, and John's already pointed out that I'm probably going to drag some of that in. However, the best example that I've seen, I was listening yesterday actually to Guy Swanger, who was telling a story about coming out of the planning meeting that we had here a couple of months ago, talking about how this conference would be. And Guy had kind of taken up a challenge that had kind of derived from this process about what the role of the investigator was. So he was explaining that he went back and he challenged his investigators to answer the question to him of what it is they did, what they brought to the police process that he couldn't get from community volunteers. Where's Guy? What'd they tell you, Guy?
Well, their first explanation was that they can effect an arrest. So then when I asked, well, how many arrests has that been in the past 6 months? There had been 2. Most of them were in custody by patrol. So we got down to it that the bulk of their day, about 96% of the day, could be done by civilians, the way they operated at that time.
So what we see is a focus in this country on highly trained, highly skilled investigative efforts that are able to get to the bottom of crimes, kind of Kojak and Columbo stuff. Unfortunately, I think if we're really honest about what happens, we'll admit that that probably doesn't occur very often. In fact, if you go back to the early 1970s, mid-1970s, the RAND Corporation examined the investigative process. Now, they took a rather different approach. They brought together a group of experienced investigators, and I think they probably did this so that John Welter would be more comfortable with the research. They brought together experienced investigators, and they gave them a sample of cases, and they asked them to examine the cases, to kind of do a content analysis and figure out why those cases that got solved. And what they found was, now these are investigators that did this, was that about 30% of cases that get solved gets solved, first of all, by an on-scene arrest. The patrol officer shows up while the bad guy's there and puts him under arrest. They noted, by the way, that that frequently occurs for one of two reasons. Either a citizen calls the police and tells them the bad guy's there, or an alarm goes off. The second category that they found was that 50% of cases that are solved were solved by a witness. Somebody told the police who did it. Basically, what they're focusing on is something that Carl Clockars drew a distinction between the whodunits and the walkthroughs. The walkthroughs Clockars describes as being the cases that you just kind of go through and you do the routine sorts of things. You process the paper, you get to the end. The whodunits are those, specialized cases that require really, clever detective work. And he was not able to find very many whodunits. In the RAND study, the detectives, in fact, what they came up with, a rather controversial conclusion, was that no more than 2.7% of cases that were solved had any creative investigative work at all. They concluded that 97.3% of cases that were solved would have been solved no matter who worked on it, so long as the routine standardized steps were followed. Out of that, throughout the 1980s, the federal government promoted a program that they called MCI, Managing Criminal Investigations. And what they basically concluded from this was that if it's the routine standardized steps that matter, then if we want to improve the investigative process, the way we do that is by coming up with checklists and a variety of things like that so that we can get investigators to do those basic sorts of things, so that we can get them just to follow the process and that we can solve cases. Now, where does all that lead us? It leads us back to 1971 in Wilmington, Delaware. I'm going to suggest to you that the Wilmington, Delaware Police Department got it right in 1971 when they concluded that patrol work had two fundamental functions. The first function was to answer calls for service, and the second function was to do crime prevention. Out of that conclusion, they reached the argument that the two primary functions of patrol, calls for service, crime prevention, were in direct conflict with each other. That it was difficult for patrol officers to do both. That in fact it was problematic for the patrol officers, and in effect it actually gave the patrol officers an out, because when they were challenged on crime prevention, they could say, we're busy answering calls for service. When they were challenged on the length of time and the difficulties in answering calls for service, they could say, we're busy out here doing crime prevention. As a result, what Wilmington did was an experiment that came to be known as the Wilmington Split Force Experiment. They divided their patrol force 70-30. 70% of the patrol force handled calls for service, 30% of the patrol force did the crime prevention function. Now, the 70% went real well. They were able to do management sorts of study, kind of time and motion kinds of studies, and find new ways to be able to more efficiently and effectively do what it was they were focusing on. They looked at temporal deployment and spatial deployment and differential response, got most of its start out of here, and so forth. And they came up with lots of ways that they could streamline the process. It was when they got to the crime prevention function that things began to break down. They sat around and they thought about what would be involved in crime prevention, and they realized that their bluff had been called. They've been saying all along that if we weren't doing all of these kinds of standard things, if we weren't pressed with the rush of handling calls for service, if we had free time, then we could really be proactive. Well, now they had free time, and the problem was they couldn't think of anything to be proactive. They didn't know how. So they brought in the consultants, the academics and so forth, and you know what? They didn't know what to do either. As a result, they took the crime prevention unit and they used the standard management fallback. They said if we turn them out there and we don't encumber them with a lot of restrictions, they'll figure it out. They'll come up with something creative. What the crime prevention unit basically did was to create a new detective division in the police department. So they essentially had two. And in a way that sort of worked, because the patrol officers very quickly were able to follow up on calls as they happened. They would arrive immediately, and those 30% of officers would follow the investigation through. And this really worked with the MCI argument, because what they were saying was that we needed to get to those investigations very quickly while the witnesses were still there, and we could, the information was still fresh, and we could draw that information, and the patrol officers were able to do that. Seemed to produce some positive results. And they even argued that it was good for the detectives because it freed the detectives up then from those standard sort of easy walk-through cases so that they could use their special skills on the more complex cases that really needed those Kojak-style investigations. As you can imagine, the clearance rates for patrol went way up. The clearance rates for detectives went way down, and it created a great deal of tension. Much like we've seen with a lot of problem-solving units as well in police departments, the patrol officers answering calls for service became angry at the crime prevention officers because we're out here shagging these calls, working ourselves to death. You're over here taking all the credit. The detectives, meanwhile, they got upset because these untrained patrol officers are contaminating our scenes and so forth and so on. What wound up happening at the end of a year's worth of experiment was that the police department largely concluded that the system that they had put in place made sense, but it had disrupted the processes in the organization so badly they didn't want to continue doing it. It created a lot of internal problems in the organization, and eventually faded away. Unfortunately, I think what Wilmington did, their mistake, was that they didn't go far enough. Contrary to what they thought then, and I think to what most problem-oriented policing proponents think today, this isn't a patrol problem. It's a police department problem. I'm going to suggest to you instead that the police themselves have two primary functions. The first is to respond reactively to things that have already happened. That involves crimes, it involves order maintenance, it involves emergencies, traffic accidents, the whole assortment of things. And I'm going to suggest to you that from what we know about the investigative process, that the point that Chief Welter just made when he was talking about something that Tim Ottmeyer had said is very true, that there's no reason in the world we shouldn't follow the MCI model, but instead of simply asking the patrol officers to take on more of the responsibility to carry investigations further before they turn them over to the detective division, I'm going to argue to you that we should lump those functions together, that there isn't much of a difference in the investigative process and the call for service process, that the patrol officers should be capable of taking that investigation along with the rest of their calls for service and working it all the way through. And we saw in the examination of the investigative process, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to do that. In effect, we turn the patrol officers into the process that Deborah Weissel described. We have them out there solving problems. They're able to apply the skills that we've been training them all along to examine in a fairly narrow way gas drive-offs and be able to come up with solutions to make those repeat calls for service diminish, or domestic violence or chase burglars and so forth, to be able to apply the process in a less thorough way, but in a somewhat systematic way where they're focused on either reducing calls for service or reducing the problem or whatever. Meanwhile, the highly trained specialists in the police department, what we now think of as detectives, would become the ones who would actually do the work at problem solving, the in-depth, systematic type. It would be their responsibility now not to focus on simply clearing the last crime that occurred, but it would be their focus to do what was suggested yesterday, that George Kelling had argued that the goal of the police department should be to prevent the next crime. It becomes their responsibility to carry that focus through. So instead of simply looking at the ability to clear the next crime, we should look at their ability to eliminate or sharply reduce the crime category. We've already defined the categories, by the way, that we think are important. We have burglary units, yet we don't hold them responsible for reducing burglary. We have gang units, but what we discover in every department is that after the gang unit is created, there suddenly is an explosion of gang activity, which either was already there or is simply now being used to justify the unit. The same thing with juvenile crime and a variety of other units. Those units, I'm arguing, should be held accountable for actually focusing on the problem and finding either ways to eliminate, alleviate, or reduce the harm, the basic problem-solving goals that we talk about, so that those problems become more manageable. As the officers in Wilmington observed long ago, such an approach allows you to establish clear lines of accountability, clear functional responsibilities. It allows you to remove the ambiguity in both individual performance evaluations as well as organizational evaluations. So, to sum up, I want to return to the original question that we were given and tell you that investigators don't lead or follow in the problem-solving process. They are, or at least should be, the problem solvers. Thank you. John?
Okay, we back on again. So at this point, you can see, I think, Dennis and I, when we started this, we were not really sure where the other one was going to come from. In fact, it was kind of set up to be, let's take the gloves off and have the practitioner and the academic battle this out. The more I listened to his comments, I think there are a lot of areas where we kind of overlapped in regards to what the role of the investigator should be, what it is, how much does the organization support, lack support, culture, so on and so forth. So with that, I think it would be great if we spend the next 25 minutes, which we have, maybe taking some comments or questions from the audience. Greg, we have a mic down here.
That's all right. We probably don't have an answer anyway.
Yeah, Dennis, if I could ask you, because you're from New York, detectives are organized and their function somewhat different in different areas, but I know in New York, if I understand it, patrol officers make an arrest, they handle it all the way through arraignment, detectives kind of work on their own. But a lot of departments, especially in California, if not most of them, it's a different approach. In LA, the officer makes the arrest and just deposits it in him or her in jail and then moves on, and the detectives play with that from that point on. How does the model you're envisioning, and most departments, I believe, do that because their patrol forces are so busy. If they handle a call from receipt to investigation to arrest and processing, that car, when you're only putting out 8 or 10 cars, you lose many of them. You see what I'm getting at? Mm-hmm. There's a difference where in New York, the model you're talking about would, I think, work very well.
Well, first I have to confess I'm not from New York. I've actually been a professor at John Jay Olive about a month now. I live in Washington, and for those of you who follow the Washington, D.C. Police Department, we don't actually really investigate crime there. I would say that I really don't actually. There are obviously two different approaches, and I don't find, in a sense, I guess they're incompatible, but in a sense they're not with what I'm proposing. We talk about, for example, the issue with police officers, patrol officers not having time to do problem solving is that they don't have a lot of free time and so forth, and yet management people who look at the subject find that consistently patrol officers have about 50 or 60% of their time is really uncommitted. When you take out things like, I think John mentioned getting your hair cut and a bunch of other things, there's a whole lot of discretionary time in there. And what we've really focused on is how you use that discretionary time, you put it together in blocks and so forth to be able to do problem solving. I would suggest that instead that you should be putting that time together to have them following up on investigations, and that they should take those cases, as Tim said, from cradle to grave, that there's no reason why they respond, they can take the investigation and they can follow it all the way through. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me if the key to solving cases is the quality of information that witnesses and victims give you, which appears to be the case. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to have somebody go out and do a preliminary investigation. They have no sense of ownership of the case because it isn't their case. They're going to kick it off to somebody else, and what they're going to do is take the report and get out of there as quickly as they can. So they write down as little information as they can, and 3 or 4 or 5 days later, whatever, it weaves its way through the department, actually makes it to a detective who realizes that the only contact information is a post office box. And so he or she then has to go out and conduct a preliminary investigation again. In effect, what we've done is we've given the bad guy a week head start, and the witnesses have scattered and that sort of thing, and so we decrease the probability that there's going to be a clearance. Give it to the patrol officer in the first place and let him or her take it all the way through. And then take that problem-solving issue that we've given to the patrol officers, and let's move that over here to the investigator, or what we think of now as the investigator, because they have plenty of time to be able to attack the problem or focus on the problem in a much more global way. So I would go back to the split. And I would not draw the distinction as you describe it between the kind of the East Coast, West Coast version. I would draw the distinction someplace else.
This question's for John. I heard last night when I was taking some friends back to their hotel that you've, in San Diego now, assigned investigative units to a variety of assistant chiefs. Can you explain that and why you've done that?
Yeah, we had in the past, we had all of our investigations units under one chief structure, and we had 7 assistant chiefs, so all of that was under one chief, and all of patrol was under one chief, and we had a lot of support services under one chief. And we recognized, or at least some of us on the 7th floor, the administration floor of the chief's complex, that what you had in effect was one chief controlling all of the operations of investigations. And that particular chief, whatever his or her culture or understanding of what investigators should do, controlled much of that. That's one issue. The second issue is you had patrol and investigations separated by having all of investigations under one chief and all of patrol under another. And so when you expected patrol or investigations to work together on issues, they rarely did because they saw themselves as separate units. By splitting it up, what we did was we divided the city up and we split it up among 3 different chiefs, which in effect, I'm hoping, this is my hope that this will occur, will force these chiefs to begin to work together across some of their own boundaries that they've created at that level. But in addition, force some of the investigative units to be looking at sharing resources with their patrol units under the same organizational structure, because a chief has the responsibility for all the resources that are given for that particular unit that they're responsible for. And if they're not sharing those resources over with patrol or vice versa, patrol to investigations, it's generally because they don't have the responsibility to do that. And they really want to protect their own turf. So part of it was to encourage communication at the administrative level, at the command level, at the chief's level. Part of it was to encourage patrol and traffic, forcing them to work together closely, hopefully, and passing on some of the problem solving that we expect to occur in both units.
John, just a quick follow-up. What I heard was that you've got units, specific units, reporting to specific chiefs. In other words, the chief doesn't have all investigative units for geographical areas.
Correct. Yeah, and one chief would have, as an example, George Salamondo, assistant chief here in the room. George, I think you have gangs, narcotics. Where are you? I'm looking for you. There you are. Gangs, narcotics, and something else.
Central Division, Western Division, Northern Division, Communications, Washington.
So George has 2 investigative units, 3 patrol commands out of 8, and then a couple of support units. And each one of the chiefs have all 3 of those. They have support units, they have patrol units, and they have investigative units, specific units, which then I think again forces them to share resources and communicate better. Bill?
Ellen Scrivener, who had to leave early this morning, had a question yesterday in a conversation with Nancy that I eavesdropped on, Nancy McPherson. Ellen's background is as a clinical psychologist, and she's also very knowledgeable about adult learning. And listening to the early presentations and thinking about John Eck's background piece for the conference, Ellen began wondering whether there is a misfit between the basic problem-solving model, which is the ancient scientific method, but it gets called SARA in our business, whether there's a misfit between that problem-solving model and the cognitive process that most police officers use. John, you said earlier this morning, cops hate meetings. I don't know whether detectives hate them more or less than patrol officers, but it does raise the question whether there's something about the kind of people that are brought into police work these days, that the basic cognitive process they use, which just is out of sync with the requirements of a problem-solving approach. And I wonder if either or both of you might comment on that.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is that new cops that come into the organization, they're young cops. They want to do the fun, reactionary police stuff that they see on the cop shows or on the whatever the various programs are that come up. And that's their culture. And so it's very hard for a young cop, in my opinion, to take on, as Dennis mentioned, all the complexities of problem solving and understand. It's hard enough to just manage their particular job in a reactive response mode, much less get into more of a proactive from a patrol's perspective. From an investigator's perspective, I think, again, the investigator also sees himself or herself as a reactionary. The whole purpose is the crime is committed and we need to make sure that we catch the person who committed the crime. And that seems to be their focus. And I don't think that that's all bad. As I mentioned earlier, I think society expects that. We certainly need that. I know in homicide in 1991, when I was there as a lieutenant, we had 167 murders in 1 year. And the next year we had 156. And our cancellation rate in homicide was only about 56 to 63%, I think, in those 2 years respectively. That's woefully low for homicide. In the last couple of years, we're down to around 50 murders per year. We have reduced the homicide unit a bit as far as in size, but given the time now, they're solving more crimes. Their cancellation rate is up in Pat Drummy from Crime Analysis. I don't know if you're aware. 75. Okay, so 75% homicides now, and that to me is much more palatable, much more acceptable that we should be solving murders. But you know what I find interesting is we spend all the effort in investigations on murders, and yet we send a single patrol cop out on what would be in our state a 245 or assault with a deadly weapon, where we shoot somebody and they happen to survive only because of the grace of God or great paramedic service or whatever it may be. And that one cop does that investigation. And as we all know, the preliminary investigation is so important. That tells me something about how we see the investigative process. Dennis?
I would have, I guess, two observations to that. First of all, since Ellen controls the vast majority of funding, I agree with everything she thinks. But secondly, I don't think so, actually. I think you're seeing two things come together. First of all, we live in a society that likes quick fixes. We notice, for example, that we have a few shootings happen in schools, and immediately there's a giant wave to put up metal detectors at every school, despite the fact that when we examine each of the shootings, you know, they began outside the school and so forth and so on, and there's no reason to believe that those would work. But we like those kind of quick technological solutions. The second thing that we saw, and again drawing from the comparison with schools, is that as we began to get students involved in the problem-solving process, we found that teachers had the same problems that police officers had when it came to collaborating. The teachers were used to being in an environment where it was their classroom, they're in charge of the classroom, and so it was very difficult to get them out of the mode of being directive of the process as opposed to collaborative with the process. So I think what happens is you get two things come together. We naturally have a tendency to want to be able to fix things quickly without having to get very deeply focused on what the problem is, and a profession or a combination of professions that have an expectation that they be in charge and that they answer quickly, and I think those collide together. I don't see any reason. In fact, I teach college students who are also police officers, and if that were the case, then I would think we would find that the police officers who were students somehow were not as analytic and as capable as the other students, and that's just not the case. So I think that there's no reason in the world why they can't do it.
Dennis, I have a reflection on your comments about domestic violence and problem solvers in policing versus people in domestic violence, the advocates. It seems to me that when we came up with mandatory arrest policies, that is a form of a response that was based on problem solving, and that excuse me, that was implemented on a policy level in departments all across the country. And I think we get confused between responses that are case-specific and responses that are made at the policy level. When I was involved in a problem-solving project here in Seattle, what we found was that when you involve community members in problem-solving, they want responses that they can implement, and those become case-specific. They also tend to kind of swim against the tide of systemic issues that are leading our justice systems in different ways. For example, we have offenders in that neighborhood who have an average of 25 previous arrests, and yet the preferred responses to that were not to talk to judges, try and involve the other parts of the justice system, or look at systemic policy or new laws or issues like that. They wanted to do CEPTED. They wanted to work on their block and things that they could implement. And I think when we think about problem solving, we need to make a distinction between policy level responses that can be portable, that can, in a sense, be off the shelf in a lot of cases and go from one city to another, and case-specific responses that are just for that location or that problem.
I sort of agree with you. I would go back a step, actually, and where I would disagree with is where the mandatory arrest policies came from. They actually are derived from 1, weak research, and 2, lawsuits. And I would agree with the point that you have particularly, lawsuits and external pressures that drive a lot of police responses. But I think that really makes the point, though, that what we have done is we're faced with a serious social problem. And the easy solution is to develop a response, one size fits all, and declare that that's what we're going to do. And a lot of states do that, even though now the research suggests that it doesn't work and so forth the way it was originally proposed. Now, you can make arguments in favor of arrest anyway, but that doesn't square very well with the problem-solving community policing notion. I think what we're seeing is a recognition there that we deal with a lot of complex problems, and maybe we don't want police officers, at least individually, being able to make the decisions of what's important and what's not important and so forth. Back to the point of leadership, that the organizations need to do that. So I guess I sort of agree with you. Yeah.
And I think also that I agree with your point, and I think that there can be both. And I think many times a good problem-solving effort starts with an arrest. And unfortunately, what you have is you get a lot of young cops, whether they be patrol or investigators, that seem to hear the message that it has to be one or the other. And just because we're making a mandatory arrest on a DV, quite frankly, I think that's a good thing. Quite frankly, I see, having worked child abuse and having worked some of those units where you see the violence in the home and how that contributes to more crime, I think a mandatory arrest is a good first step toward a problem-solving effort and doesn't necessarily preclude one from then looking further into the issue and trying to determine what can we do to prevent more violence in this home, and what can we learn from this specific case to apply generally to the domestic violence problem in a particular neighborhood or community. So I'm in favor of mandatory arrest, just like I'm in favor of 3 strikes laws, and I don't necessarily see that that's a conflict with the problem-solving effort. In the back there? Is that Craig?
It is. Dr. Kinney, I remember from your book, Crime in the Schools, that you had some significant success teaching high school students problem-solving skills. Why do you think that you've been unsuccessful in giving these same skills to patrol officers?
I didn't train them. I think that the nature of the setting is partially responsible for it. For the students, it's something of an academic exercise that takes place in the classroom. It's a very collaborative thing. They're graded on it, so there's real incentives for them to work together. For police officers, they don't have the same sorts of motivations. They've got day-to-day press of other activities and the need to demonstrate results and those sorts of things. So I think the settings probably have a lot to do with the difference. I hope that answers the question.
Gary.
Dr. Kenny, this is for you primarily, but I'd like to hear your response too, Chief, if you have one to the question. You were talking earlier in your presentation about why problem solving doesn't happen. And one of the reasons that you suggested is that police administrators don't really want it. If that premise is true and they really don't want it or they don't mean it, how would you suggest that we change the culture of law enforcement, and within that culture, the subculture of investigators, to do something as unglamorous as problem solving versus the more glamorous aspects of catching crooks?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Let me try and restate it. If the culture, if the administration, if the philosophy is we don't really believe it or we don't really want it, yet you suggest that we change what we do as far as investigators to make them problem solving rather than suspect focused, how would you suggest that we do that if especially from the administration, the leaders, they're not buying into that from the start? What you have is a solution, but I don't see you addressing the problem of the philosophy and the administration not really buying into it.
That's one of the great things about my job as an academic. I don't actually have to do anything. Yeah, I would prefer to think actually that it's that administrators either consciously or subconsciously don't want problem solving to work or problem solving to spread at the level that we say that we do, because the alternative is that they just aren't very good at what they're doing. In 20 years that we haven't come up with better methods of evaluating performance and that sort of thing that we know, and it's oftentimes stated that people do what they're evaluated on. And so that in 20 years that we haven't at least come up with some better efforts at doing that, and there are a couple but not many, suggests that there's either a conscious or at least subconscious neglect, or that administrators are just, or leaders are simply failing to do their jobs. How we deal with that, I think, how we change the culture, I think is the way you change any culture. I think we probably were off to a very good start with problem solving. Goldstein wrote, the initial pieces, and it rang true with a lot of people. And, some police departments sat back and embraced the concepts and began to focus on adopting the changes and so forth, and testing the different versions, which is, quite frankly, I think is an important step. You move incrementally, you test different options. Those that work, you keep. Those that don't, you either discard or revise. It's not unlike the problem-solving process itself. You kind of move along slowly. And I think that was taking place. And then all of a sudden, like team policing, the same thing happened. Those of you who've been in policing for quite some time remember team policing back in the 70s as well. It became the thing to do. And suddenly there was millions and millions of dollars out there for grants and so forth. And so what happened is all sorts of people who neither knew the concept, understood the concept, or were committed to the concept jumped in, either because there were grants or because it was the right thing to do, or you're a Neanderthal if you don't, or whatever. But everybody rushed in. And so I would say that the greatest failure of problem solving, probably in the same way the greatest failure has been traced to team policing, is that it never happened. We changed some rhetoric, and that's all we changed. And as a result, nothing really occurred, and so we declared it to be a failure. That certainly would not be the first time that's occurred in criminal justice. It's been noted several places in different aspects, corrections and so forth as well, that we're one of the few professions that with most innovations can sit back and say, we didn't do it and it didn't work. And so changing the culture, I think, is something that happens slowly, subtly from within, and you get a few agencies that lead from the top. And I think what we've attempted to do consistently is push from the bottom. And I think that's probably wrong.
And I think the leadership from the top is going to come as those agencies spend more and more time and promote more and more people that have actually been doing problem solving, or at least solving problems in some way. But I have to agree with Dr. Kinney that, I think there's a lot of administrators that don't really care whether it happens. I'm not sure that they don't want it to happen. I think the real issue is that they don't become students of what the whole process and movement is about. They don't, they look at it as either a grant or some kind of a program, and I can't count the number of times I've done training for chiefs and throughout the state of California, or go into their organization and do training. I know Sergeant Jeff Dean and I have went into one agency, and the chief was very supportive. I've gone into other agencies where the chief didn't even show up to greet me and or open up the session with all of his command staff to talk about this movement to quote-unquote community policing. And yet he will tell you, oh yeah, I'm very supportive, I'm right behind you, I want to do whatever I can do. And that's what I find a lot of too, is people saying, I'm right behind you. But the question is, are they willing to assume a leadership role and move up front? Are they willing to lead the effort in their respective organizations? And in order to do that, they have to become a student of where policing is going. And they have to be willing to take those risks and make those changes. And I think a lot of chiefs are not willing to do that. Some for political reasons, and others because they're comfortable with the way things are operating. Many chief officers believe their organizations are doing community policing, and as we've recognized, it's a bike team or it's some other tactical operation. It's not really problem-oriented policing. Yes, in the back?
I'm from Buffalo, New York, and I know that having a separate unit for community police officers has gotten a bad rap. But we were forced to do that under the grant, and we kept it that way. And what you said about community police officers becoming kind of an investigative unit has happened in Buffalo, and they're taking care of the problems that detectives would never touch, like noise, the problems that the community is concerned with. Although it's not the best solution, it does seem to work. They are doing problem solving, and you have a chance to train this unit. They have a chance to get to know what the community's priorities are, which the detectives wouldn't have a chance to do. I don't know, I think it worked out pretty well.
That's good. It sounds like you made my point. Thanks.
We have time for one more question over here on the side there.
Yes, I'm from Spokane, and I'm wondering about serial killer task force and all the resource that cost that goes into that. In Spokane, we had a series of 9 prostitutes that were killed. And as a community, we immediately got on the issue of prostitution and safety, identification, checking in, and even built a shelter for these women to come to at night. We have not had further incidents. However, we continue to pour an enormous amount of our resources into the task force to solve the problem. 18 months later, we're still working on leads that are coming in. And I think that was true in the Green River task force too. So if the theories that you're all talking about are in fact true, how can perhaps we use Washington as a benchmark for when you cut off dumping the resources when the problem seems to have gone away?
Well, and I think that goes to the heart of the problem of investigations as a whole is very complex. You've got burglary investigations, we can talk about one issue, and then to the other extreme, you've got homicide, taking of life investigations. And I know we have a couple of detectives here that were working on the Green River task force. I'm not sure when you would call off an investigation of an ongoing series of homicides. I don't think, as an administrator, I would ever want to call an investigation like that off. It does become an issue of how long you can sustain the resources to follow up on investigations of that nature, but you can't just stop doing those kind of investigations. And many times they're not necessarily, as Dennis pointed out, I think, from how we solve crimes. I mean, I still think that you solve crimes by getting out and wearing out shoe leather and talking to people and doing the basic investigative task. Whether that needs to be done by a trained investigator or whether you can bring others into that process remains to be the question. Maybe something you can discuss on your breakout.
Thank you so much. Really a great way to